the Ecliptica Prime drifted silently through the endless void, a ghost of its former self. Its once pristine hull, now scarred and blackened, reflected the faint glimmers of distant stars. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and cold. The hum of life support systems, once a comforting background noise, had faded to an intermittent wheeze, like the labored breaths of a dying creature. Commander Kale Veyron moved through the dim corridors, his steps slow and deliberate. His emerald green scales, which once shimmered with vitality, were now dull and cracked, a testament to the weeks of starvation and despair. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of the ship's failing structure. Kale's clawed hand brushed against the wall for balance as he walked, though he didn't need to. He knew every inch of the ship by heart, but his body was weak, his movements sluggish. It had been 3 rotations, 3 endless cycles since the engines had failed. Their distress signals, sent out like desperate cries into the abyss, had gone unanswered. He paused outside the door to the central chamber, his sharp ears catching the faint murmurs of his remaining crew. The door slid open with a reluctant hiss, revealing the survivors. 14 of them, huddled together on the floor, their gaunt faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single emergency lamp. First Officer Rhinel Taries sat closest to the door, her once commanding presence reduced to a fragile figure wrapped in a threadbare thermal blanket. Her silver eyes, dulled by exhaustion, met Kale's as she asked, her voice barely audible, "How much longer, Commander?" Kale didn't need to check the failing life support systems. He had memorized the numbers long ago, replaying them in his mind like a grim mantra. 18 hours, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the truth. Maybe less. A heavy silence fell over the room. The crew didn't cry or protest. They had no strength left for such things. They had already made peace with their fate. Each of them had recorded their final messages, spoken their goodbyes to loved ones who would likely never hear them, and resigned themselves to the cold embrace of death. Kale stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his crew. He had led them on countless missions, faced dangers that would have broken lesser beings, but this was different. This was betrayal. He clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. The catastrophic failure of the engines had been too precise, too calculated. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had wanted them to die out here, forgotten and alone. Kale turned and left the chamber, retreating to what remained of the command deck. He sat in the captain's chair, the leather worn and cracked beneath him, and activated the ship's log recorder. His voice, though hoarse, carried a quiet determination. He spoke not just for himself, but for the crew he had sworn to protect. But before he could finish, a sound shattered the silence. A crackle, faint at first, then sharper, like static breaking through a storm. Kale froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew clearer, resolving into a voice. "This is Captain Elias Mercer of the Earth Federation ship Resolute. We've received your distress signal. Hold tight, we're on our way." Kale stared at the console, his mind struggling to process the words. The humans. Out here? His people had always dismissed humanity as a young, impulsive species, barely worthy of notice on the galactic stage. Yet now, when no one else had answered their cries for help, it was the humans who had come. Back in the central chamber, the crew stirred for the first time in days. Hollow eyes widened, and whispers spread like wildfire. Hope, fragile and hesitant, began to take root. Kale leaned back in his chair, his claws tapping against the armrest as a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Relief. Gratitude. Suspicion. Perhaps all three. But one thought burned brighter than the rest: we are not alone. The Resolute emerged from the void like a silver beacon, its hull smooth and gleaming as if untouched by the harshness of space. Its presence was a stark contrast to the battered remains of the Ecliptica Prime, whose jagged scars and dim lights spoke of weeks of suffering. The human's ship glided closer, its engines humming softly, a sound that carried a strange reassurance, like the steady heartbeat of something alive. Inside the Resolute, Captain Elias Mercer stood on the bridge, his posture firm yet calm. His deep-set eyes scanned the data on the console before him, but his thoughts were already on the task ahead. Around him, his crew moved with practiced precision, their faces a mixture of determination and unease. "Structural integrity on their ship is critical," said Commander Lila Carter, the chief engineer, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "If we don't act fast, the whole thing could collapse. One wrong move, and we'll lose them." Mercer gave a curt nod, his voice calm but resolute. "Then we don't make a wrong move. Get the rescue teams ready. We're bringing them home." The airlock of the Resolute hissed open, releasing a faint mist as the two ships connected. Cale Veyron stood on the other side, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim lighting of his dying vessel. His ceremonial cloak, once a symbol of authority and pride, hung loosely around his shoulders, its edges frayed and stained. His emerald scales, dulled from exhaustion, caught the faint light from the airlock, giving him an almost spectral appearance. As the human captain stepped forward, Cale's sharp eyes studied him. Elias Mercer was shorter than Cale, his features softer, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Mercer extended a hand, his expression open but firm. Cale hesitated. The gesture was familiar, he had studied Earth customs during his training. It was a sign of peace, of trust. Slowly, he raised his clawed hand and pressed his palm against Mercer's. The human's skin felt warm, almost fragile, compared to Cale's rough, scaled touch. "Your presence here is unexpected," Cale said, his voice low and measured. There was gratitude in his tone, but also a flicker of suspicion. Mercer met his gaze steadily. "Unexpected, maybe. But necessary. Let's get your people out of here." The humans worked quickly, their movements efficient but careful. Rescue teams spread through the corridors of the Ecliptica Prime, guiding the Arcani's survivors to safety. The humans' voices carried through the ship, calm and reassuring, like anchors in a storm. Dr. Olivia Merrick, the Resolute's xenobiologist, knelt beside one of the injured Arcanis. Her sharp eyes took in every detail of their physiology, their shimmering scales, the bioluminescent veins that pulsed faintly beneath their skin, the way their bodies seemed to fight against the damage despite their weakened state. "Incredible," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "Their regenerative abilities, it's like their cells are trying to rebuild even now." The Arcanis she was tending to stirred, his eyes flickering open for a moment. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and awe, as though he couldn't quite believe the humans were real. Meanwhile, deep within the Ecliptica Prime, Commander Lila Carter moved through the wreckage with a small team. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and stale oxygen. Sparks flickered from damaged panels, casting fleeting bursts of light across the twisted corridors. "This wasn't an accident," Lila muttered, her sharp gaze scanning the damage. She crouched beside a destroyed console, her fingers brushing over the edges of the wreckage. The cuts were too clean, too precise. Someone had sabotaged the ship, targeting critical systems with surgical accuracy. "Commander," one of her team called out, his voice tense. "You need to see this." Lila turned and followed him to a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a crystalline artifact, its surface smooth and almost impossibly clear. It pulsed faintly with a light that seemed to come from within, casting soft, shifting patterns on the walls around it. "What the hell is this?" Lila whispered, reaching out but stopping just short of touching it. The artifact seemed alive, its glow hypnotic, almost otherworldly. "Whatever it is," she said after a moment, "it's not supposed to be here. And someone didn't want them to have it." Back at the airlock, the last of the Arcani's survivors were brought aboard the Resolute. Kale lingered behind, his sharp eyes watching as his crew disappeared into the safety of the human ship. In his hand, concealed beneath the folds of his cloak, was a small data core. Its surface was smooth and cold, unremarkable to the untrained eye, but Kale knew its value. The core contained secrets that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. But those secrets came with a price. If the wrong people discovered what he carried, it wouldn't just be his crew who paid the cost. As Kale stepped onto the Resolute, he felt the weight of the core grow heavier in his hand. He glanced back at his ship one last time, its broken form barely clinging to life. "Goodbye," he whispered, though whether it was to the ship, his past, or something else entirely, even he wasn't sure. The airlock sealed behind him, and the Resolute pulled away, carrying with it the last remnants of the Ecliptica Prime and the fragile hope of something greater. The Resolute hummed softly as it drifted through the quiet expanse of space, its interior bathed in the faint, sterile glow of overhead lights. In the captain's quarters, Kale Veyron stood by the wide viewport, his tall figure silhouetted against the endless blackness speckled with stars. His emerald scales reflected the faint light, but his expression was dark, his sharp features etched with unease. Captain Elias Mercer leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed, his gaze steady as he studied the alien before him. The air between them was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Kale turned slowly, his ceremonial cloak shifting like liquid shadow around him. His eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, locked onto Mercer's. "I owe you the truth," Kale began, his voice low, each word deliberate, as though he were peeling back layers of a wound he'd long kept hidden. "Our mission wasn't what it seemed. We weren't just explorers, Captain. We were seekers." Mercer tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but curious. He said nothing, letting Kale continue. "We found something," Kale said, his voice almost a whisper now, as though speaking the words aloud might summon unseen dangers. "A derelict station, ancient beyond reckoning, orbiting a star so old its light barely reaches the galaxy's edge. Inside, we uncovered technology that defied everything we knew. Machines that could bend space itself, crystals that pulsed with energy far greater than any reactor, weapons that could destroy entire fleets with a single strike." He paused, his sharp claws flexing slightly at his sides as if the memory itself unsettled him. "It could change everything. Space travel, energy, warfare. It could elevate the galaxy to heights we've only dreamed of. Or, it could tear it apart." Mercer's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "And you think that's why your ship was sabotaged?" Kale nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before rising again, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. "The Council of Eldera," he said, the name heavy with disdain. "The ruling body of the galaxy's three dominant species. They've kept a stranglehold on progress for millennia, suppressing anything that might threaten their power. To them, knowledge like this isn't a gift, it's a threat. They would rather see it destroyed than risk it falling into the hands of the lesser races. Mercer's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, the room was suddenly bathed in red light. A shrill alarm pierced the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Captain," a voice crackled over the comms. "We've got incoming. 3 ships just dropped out of FTL. They're locking weapons on us." Kale's head snapped toward the viewport, his eyes narrowing. When the ships appeared, their sleek, predatory forms gliding into view, his breath caught in his throat. The markings on their hulls were unmistakable. "Arcani's warships," he said, his voice sharp and urgent. "They're not here to rescue us. They're here to erase us." Mercer straightened, his face hardening. "Not on my watch," he said, his tone like steel. The Resolute shuddered as it began to move, its engines roaring to life. On the bridge, Mercer's crew worked with frantic precision, their hands flying over controls as they prepared for what was to come. Kale stood beside Mercer, his presence imposing yet steady. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but intense. "They won't stop. They can't let us escape. If they get their hands on that data core," his words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Mercer's eyes flicked to him, sharp and unyielding. "Then we make sure they don't." The Resolute surged forward, its sleek frame cutting through the void like a blade. Behind them, the Arcani's warships gave chase, their weapons lighting up the darkness with bolts of searing energy. The first volley slammed into the Resolute's shields, sending a tremor through the ship. "Shields holding, but not for long," one of the crew called out. "Deploy the drones," Mercer ordered. From the Resolute's underbelly, a swarm of decoy drones burst forth, scattering in all directions. Each one emitted a signal identical to the ship's, creating a web of false targets. The warships hesitated, their weapons momentarily confused, but it wasn't enough. They adjusted quickly, their firepower cutting through the drones like paper. "Not good enough," Kale muttered, his claws curling into fists. "Then we change the game," Mercer said, his voice calm but resolute. "Lila, can you get us into that asteroid field?" Commander Lila Carter's voice crackled over the comms. "It's tight, but I can do it. Just keep them off my back." The Resolute veered sharply, plunging into a dense asteroid field. Massive rocks tumbled through the void, their surfaces jagged and ancient, some glowing faintly with the radiation of nearby stars. The ship wove through the labyrinth with breathtaking precision, its engines flaring as it dodged one deadly obstacle after another. The Arcani's warships followed, their larger frames struggling to match the Resolute's agility. One clipped an asteroid, its shields flaring as debris scraped along its hull. "Radiation levels are spiking," Lila warned. "We can use it to mask our signal, but we won't be able to stay here long." "Do it," Mercer said. The Resolute dove deeper into the field, skimming the edge of a massive gas giant whose swirling clouds glowed with an eerie, golden light. The radiation belt surrounding the planet crackled with energy, a deadly barrier that threatened to tear apart anything that lingered too long. "We're losing them," one of the crew reported, relief creeping into their voice. Kale exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. But the tension in his eyes remained. "This is only a reprieve," he said quietly. "They'll come back. And next time, they'll bring more." Mercer turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply. Kale studied the human captain for a long moment. In Mercer's eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected, something rare in a galaxy ruled by fear and control. Hope. The Resolute emerged from the swirling mists of the nebula like a ghost, its hull dim to blend into the shrouded expanse. The nebula, a vast ocean of shifting colors, pulsed with an ethereal glow, clouds of pink, gold, and deep violet rippling like a living thing. Hidden within this cosmic veil lay Haven 9, an Earth Federation outpost so secretive that even its existence was a whispered rumor among the stars. As the ship approached, the station revealed itself, a dark silhouette against the nebula's brilliance. Haven 9 was a fortress of steel and shadow, its structure jagged and angular, designed to disappear into the nebula's chaotic beauty. Dim lights lined its surface, flickering faintly like dying stars, as though the station itself held its breath, wary of being discovered. Inside the Resolute, the air was thick with tension. Kale Veyron stood near the viewport, his sharp eyes fixed on the station as it loomed closer. His emerald scales shimmered faintly under the dim light, but his expression was unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of stoic calm. Captain Mercer stood beside him, his gaze steady as always, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his unease. "This is your safe haven?" Kale asked, his voice low, almost skeptical. "It looks more like a tomb." Mercer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied the station, his mind already racing ahead. "Sometimes, the safest places are the ones no one dares to look for," he said finally, his tone measured. "Let's hope that holds true." The docking process was silent and swift, the Resolute slipping into the station's embrace like a shadow merging with the night. As the airlock hissed open, the crew was greeted by the cold, sterile interior of Haven 9. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with reinforced plating that seemed to absorb sound. Every step echoed faintly, a reminder of how isolated they were from the rest of the galaxy. Waiting for them was Commander Adrian Wolf, a tall, imposing figure with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through a person. His uniform was crisp, the sharp lines of his coat emphasizing his rigid posture. Yet there was an air of weariness about him, as though the weight of his position had carved itself into his very being. "Captain Mercer," Wolf greeted, his voice cool and clipped. His gaze flicked briefly to Kale, lingering just long enough to convey his distrust. "And our guest. I assume you have a good reason for bringing an Arcanes aboard a Federation outpost." Kale bristled at the tone but said nothing, his claws twitching slightly at his sides. Mercer stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "He's not just a guest, Commander. He's the reason we're here. And if what he's brought us is as important as I think it is, then we're all going to need each other." Wolf's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "Let's see it, then." In the depths of Haven 9, within a secure chamber shielded from any outside signal, the data core was placed onto a glowing platform. The room was dark, save for the faint blue light emanating from the core as it began to hum softly. The air seemed to grow heavier as the decryption process began, the tension palpable. Kale stood slightly apart from the others, his arms crossed as he watched the process unfold. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger, fear, hope, all swirling together in a chaotic dance. He had risked everything to protect this core, to bring it here. Now, as its secrets were laid bare, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. What if it wasn't enough? What if it was already too late? The holographic display flickered to life, casting the room in a pale, ghostly light. Blueprints and schematics unfolded before them, intricate and impossibly advanced. Propulsion systems that could cut travel time between galaxies to mere days. Energy grids capable of powering entire civilizations with a fraction of the resources currently required. Weapons so precise and devastating they could rewrite the rules of warfare. The room fell silent, the weight of what they were seeing pressing down on everyone like a physical force. This, Wolf's voice was barely above a whisper, his usual composure cracking. This is centuries ahead of anything we've ever seen. If the Council knew this existed. They do, Kale interrupted, his voice sharp. And that's why they'll stop at nothing to destroy it. To destroy us. Wolf turned to him, his expression hardening. And you think the Federation should risk everything for this? For you. If we're caught, if the Council even suspects our involvement, they won't just come for you or your people. They'll come for Earth. They'll burn everything to the ground. Kale stepped forward, his eyes blazing with defiance. The Council already controls everything, Commander. They decide who prospers and who suffers. They turn entire species into slaves, all to maintain their grip on power. If you think hiding will protect you, you're a fool. They'll come for you eventually, whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you'll be ready when they do. The two men stared each other down, the tension between them crackling like static. Mercer stepped between them, his voice calm but commanding. Enough. We're not going to win this by fighting each other. Kale turned away, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Wolf exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. So what's your plan, Captain? He asked finally. Mercer glanced at Kale, then back at Wolf. We need allies. The Council may be powerful, but they've made enemies of plenty of others. If we can unite them, if we can show them what's possible, we might stand a chance. Kale nodded, his earlier anger replaced by a quiet determination. The Virelians, he said. Their engineering skills are unmatched. They've been forced to wander the stars because the Council destroyed their home world. And the three are they scholars and scientists, but they've been silenced for centuries. They'll listen. Wolf frowned, his skepticism clear. And if they don't? Then we die trying, Kale said simply. Over the next few days, the crew of the Resolute began reaching out, their messages carried through encrypted channels and whispered networks. The Virelians responded first, their nomadic fleets scattered across the galaxy but still united by a shared hatred for the Council. Their emissary, a wiry figure with bright, mechanical eyes, spoke with a quiet intensity that left no doubt about their resolve. The Threnar were more cautious, their ancient libraries and hidden enclaves long shielded from the Council's reach. But when they saw the blueprints, their hesitation melted away, replaced by a hunger for knowledge that had been denied to them for far too long. Slowly, piece by piece, a fragile alliance began to take shape. It was a network of outcasts and rebels, of species long silenced and forgotten. They were united not by power or ambition, but by a shared desire for freedom, a hope that, together, they could break the chains that bound them. But as the alliance grew, so too did the danger. Whispers of their efforts began to spread, and in the shadows, unseen eyes watched and waited. The Council would not remain blind for long. In the vastness of space, the Council of Eldera moved like a shadow, its influence spreading silently but relentlessly. The whispers of rebellion had reached their ears, and with them came a cold, calculating response. Across the galaxy, surveillance tightened like a noose, invisible eyes watching every move, every whispered conversation. The Council's grip was ironclad, and it would not tolerate dissent. Within Haven 9, the air was heavy with tension. The outpost, once a sanctuary hidden among the stars, now felt like a trap. The corridors echoed with hurried footsteps and hushed voices, each word tinged with the urgency of impending danger. The Alliance, fragile and new, was preparing for the inevitable. Kale Veyron stood in the central chamber, his eyes scanning the room as members of the Alliance gathered. His presence was commanding, his scales glinting in the dim light like shards of emerald. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the hope that had been placed upon his shoulders. It was a burden he accepted willingly, driven by a determination that burned brighter with each passing day. Captain Mercer stood beside him, his expression grim but resolute. The news had come swiftly. A council fleet had been spotted, its course set directly for Haven 9. There was no time to run, no time to hide. The moment they had all dreaded was upon them. "We knew this day would come," Kale said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The Council will not allow us to exist. They fear what we represent, a challenge to their power, a spark of hope for those they've oppressed." The room was silent, each member of the Alliance absorbing the gravity of his words. Faces from different worlds, different species, all united by a shared desire for freedom. They were rebels and outcasts, dreamers and warriors, bound together by a cause that transcended their differences. Mercer nodded, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group. "We have something they don't," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "We have each other. And we have the technology they've tried so hard to keep from us. It's time to show them what we can do." As the Council fleet approached, the Alliance moved with a coordinated precision born of desperation. The newly developed technologies, propulsion systems, energy grids, and weapons were deployed, their capabilities tested for the first time in the crucible of battle. The clash was fierce and unrelenting. The void of space lit up with the fury of conflict, energy beams slicing through the darkness like blades of light. The Alliance fought with everything they had, their ships darting and weaving among the enemy like a swarm of angry hornets. Each strike was a defiance, a refusal to bow before the might of the Council. But the cost was high. The Council's forces were vast and powerful, their ships a testament to centuries of dominance. Haven 9, the heart of the Alliance's resistance, bore the brunt of the assault. Explosions rocked the station, tearing through its defenses with merciless efficiency. The structure shuddered and groaned, its steel frame bending under the relentless barrage. In the end, the Alliance managed to repel the fleet, their combined strength and ingenuity forcing the Council to retreat. But the victory was bittersweet. Haven 9 lay in ruins, its corridors now silent, its lights extinguished. The outpost that had once been a beacon of hope was no more. As the dust settled, Kale stood among the wreckage, his heart heavy with loss but unbroken. Around him, the survivors gathered, their faces marked by exhaustion and grief, yet still burning with the fire of defiance. "We can't stay here," Mercer said, his voice rough with emotion. "We have to scatter, regroup. They'll come back, and we need to be ready." Kale nodded, his resolve hardening into something unyielding. "They will never stop hunting us," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "But we're not just running anymore. It's time we take the fight to them. Show them that we're not afraid, that we're capable of more than they ever imagined." The Alliance, though battered and bruised, was far from defeated. They had tasted the bitter sting of loss, but they had also glimpsed the power of their unity. As they prepared to scatter into the stars, each member carried with them a piece of the dream they had built together, a dream of a galaxy free from the Council's tyranny. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but Kale knew they would not walk it alone. Together, they would forge a path through the darkness, guided by the light of hope and the promise of a future worth fighting for. The galaxy trembled, not with the roar of war, but with the quiet, calculated defiance of the alliance. Like shadows slipping through cracks, they struck where the Council least expected, supply lines severed in the dead of night, communication hubs silenced before alarms could sound. These were not battles fought with brute force, but with precision and purpose, each strike a needle piercing the Council's vast, bloated empire. Kale Veyron stood at the helm of the Resolute, his piercing gaze fixed on the holographic map before him. The flickering display showed the network of the Council's control, supply routes snaking across the galaxy, glowing nodes marking their fortified hubs. Each time a node dimmed, it was a small victory, a crack in the armor of their oppressors. "We aren't here to destroy them," Kale said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of determination. "Not yet. We're here to remind them that they are not untouchable. That their power is not absolute." Around him, the crew nodded, their faces set with grim resolve. These were no longer just rebels or outcasts, they were revolutionaries, their purpose forged in the fires of loss and hope. Every strike they launched was a message, a whisper carried across the stars: the Council's reign is not eternal. Far from the front lines, in the heart of a hidden laboratory buried deep within an asteroid field, Dr. Merrick and Lila Carter worked tirelessly, their minds and hands driven by a singular goal. The lab was a chaotic symphony of activity. Alien scientists and engineers from allied species moved with purpose, their voices a blend of languages that somehow harmonized. The air buzzed with the hum of machines and the crackle of energy fields, the scent of heated metal and ozone sharp in the confined space. Dr. Merrick, his face lined with both age and brilliance, bent over a glowing console, his fingers dancing across its surface. His eyes, sharp and calculating, reflected the light of the ancient schematics before him. These were the blueprints salvaged from the data core. Kale had risked everything to protect technology so advanced it bordered on the miraculous. "This is it," Merrick murmured, his voice tinged with awe as he adjusted a projection of swirling energy patterns. "A way to break free of their chains. A way to give the galaxy back its freedom." Lila Carter stood beside him, her dark hair pulled back, her sharp eyes scanning the data with equal intensity. She was younger, her hands steadier, but her heart carried the same fire. "If we can make this work," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, "the Council will lose one of their greatest weapons. They've controlled the stars for too long. It's time we take them back." Their breakthrough came in the form of a new kind of faster-than-light travel, one that bypassed the Council's heavily monitored jump gates. The Council's gates were the arteries of their empire, each one carefully guarded, each jump recorded and controlled. But this new technology, this ancient gift rediscovered, was something else entirely. It was elegant and simple, a method that harnessed the natural currents of the universe itself. The first test was conducted in secret, the prototype ship a patchwork of designs from a dozen different species. The crew, a mix of engineers and pilots, stood in quiet anticipation as the ship hummed to life. The air inside the control room was electric, every breath held as the ship disappeared into the void. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that stretches endlessly in the vacuum of space. Then, the ship reappeared, its hull glowing faintly from the energy of the jump. The crew erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the chamber. For the first time in millennia, the stars were no longer the Council's to command. The galaxy had been given back its freedom. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly, carried by encrypted channels and whispered networks. Across the galaxy, species that had long been bound by the Council's chains began to dream of something greater. The Virelians, with their nomadic fleets, rejoiced at the prospect of traveling freely once more. The Threnar, their ancient libraries filled with maps of forgotten worlds, began planning expeditions to reclaim their lost knowledge. Even those who had once been too afraid to act found courage in the promise of a future unbound. Kale watched this transformation with a quiet pride. He saw the way the alliance grew stronger, not just in numbers but in spirit. The strikes against the council became more coordinated, more daring. Supply depots vanished in bursts of light, their resources redirected to feed the rebellion. Communication hubs fell silent, their signals replaced by messages of defiance. And yet, through it all, Kale knew the danger was growing. The council would not sit idly by while their grip on the galaxy slipped. They would strike back, harder and more ruthlessly than ever before. But for the first time, Kale felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: hope. One evening, as the Resolute drifted in the shadow of a distant moon, Kale stood alone on the observation deck. The stars stretched out before him, infinite and untouchable. He thought of his home, of the people he had lost, of the countless lives still suffering under the council's rule. Mercer joined him, his footsteps soft against the metal floor. "You should get some rest," the captain said, his voice gentle but firm. "Tomorrow's another fight." Kale shook his head, his gaze never leaving the stars. "There's no rest for us, Mercer. Not yet. Not until the council is nothing more than a memory." Mercer sighed, but there was no arguing with Kale's resolve. "We've come so far," he said. "But the road ahead, it's going to be harder than anything we've faced." Kale turned to him, his green eyes glowing faintly in the starlight. "The road was never going to be easy," he said. "But we've lit a spark, Mercer. And if we keep it alive, it'll grow into something the council can't extinguish." The captain nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then we'd better make sure it burns bright." Together, they stood in silence, two figures against the vastness of the galaxy. Around them, the stars seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if bearing witness to the birth of something extraordinary. The spark of revolution had been lit, and it would not be snuffed out. Not now. Not ever. The barren moon of Sanctuary Prime was a desolate place, its surface a jagged expanse of gray rock and dust. It had no atmosphere, no life, and no beauty, only silence, broken by the faint hum of energy shields protecting the Alliance's headquarters. But it was here, in this forgotten corner of the galaxy, that the fate of countless worlds would be decided. The Council of Eldora, desperate to crush the rebellion that threatened its centuries-old dominance, launched a full-scale attack. Their fleet descended upon Sanctuary Prime like a storm, a wall of gleaming ships blotting out the stars. The Alliance's forces, though united in purpose, were painfully outnumbered. 3-1. The odds were impossible, yet they stood firm. Kale Veyron paced the command center, his emerald scales catching the cold light of the monitors. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. Around him, officers of every species worked in frantic unison, their voices blending into a symphony of urgency. "They're closing in on the eastern quadrant," Mercer reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "If we don't act now, they'll breach the outer defenses." Kale turned to him, his jaw set. "We'll act," he said firmly. "But not the way they expect." The Alliance had no choice but to rely on humanity's ingenuity and the unity of their coalition. The battle began with a series of decoy tactics: small, unmanned ships darting through the enemy lines, drawing fire away from the main fleet. The Council, arrogant and accustomed to victory, fell for the ruse. Their ships pursued the decoys, leaving gaps in their formation. It was in those gaps that the Alliance struck. Using advanced shields and newly developed propulsion systems, their ships moved faster than the Council could anticipate, weaving through enemy fire like whispers in the wind. Energy beams lit up the black void, explosions blooming like fiery flowers in the cold vacuum of space. Kale's voice echoed through the command center as he directed the fleet. Focus fire on their flagships. Cut off their command structure. If we take their leaders out, the rest will falter. The Alliance's forces fought with a ferocity born of desperation and hope. Pilots pushed their ships to the limit, their hands steady even as alarms blared and hulls groaned under the strain. Engineers worked tirelessly to keep shields operational, their sweat mingling with the sparks flying from damaged consoles. Every individual played their part, their efforts woven together like threads in a tapestry. The Council, for all its power, was unprepared for the Alliance's resolve. Their ships began to falter, their formations crumbling under the relentless assault. Kale watched as one of the Council's flagships exploded, its fiery wreckage scattering across the battlefield. For the first time, he saw fear in the enemy's movements. "They're retreating," Mercer said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We're pushing them back." Kale didn't smile. He couldn't afford to. "Don't let up," he ordered. "Make them remember this day. Make them remember what happens when they underestimate us." The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. The Council's fleet, battered and humiliated, began to withdraw. Sanctuary Prime, though scarred and shaken, stood victorious. For the first time in history, the Council of Eldora had suffered a defeat, a wound to their pride that would never fully heal. As the Alliance's ships regrouped, Kale stood in silence, his gaze fixed on the wreckage littering the battlefield. It was a victory, but it had come at a cost. Lives had been lost, sacrifices made. Yet, in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The Council was not invincible. They could be defeated. And this was only the beginning. 5 years passed, and the galaxy was no longer the same. The Alliance, now known as the Coalition of Free Worlds, had grown into something extraordinary. Dozens of species had joined their ranks, united by a shared vision of freedom and prosperity. The technologies they had developed together brought life to countless worlds. Planets that had once been barren now thrived, their skies filled with ships traveling freely, unbound by the Council's chains. Sanctuary Prime, once a battlefield, had been transformed into a symbol of hope. Its surface now housed a gleaming city, a hub of diplomacy and innovation where representatives from every corner of the galaxy gathered. The Coalition had become more than a rebellion, it was a beacon, a reminder that unity could overcome even the darkest forces. Kale Veyron stood on the observation deck of the Coalition's flagship, his gaze fixed on the stars. He had changed over the years, his scales dulled slightly with age, his expression more thoughtful, but the fire in his eyes remained. He had become a key leader in the Coalition, a symbol of the resistance that had reshaped the galaxy. Beside him, Admiral Elias Mercer leaned against the railing, his uniform crisp, his presence steady. The two men shared a quiet camaraderie, forged through years of struggle and triumph. "When we answered your distress call," Mercer said, his voice soft, "I never imagined it would lead to this." Kale smiled faintly, his gaze never leaving the stars. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But perhaps the universe needed a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of space, hope can still shine." Mercer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, a single call for help, can spark a revolution." Kale turned to him, his smile deepening. Small things have always been the beginning of great change. A spark becomes a flame. A flame becomes a fire. And a fire can burn away the old to make way for the new. The two men stood in silence, the stars stretching endlessly before them. The galaxy was vast, its voids deep and unforgiving, but they had proven that no one deserved to be left behind. The coalition's message was clear: unity and resilience could overcome even the most insurmountable odds. As Kale looked out at the stars, he felt a quiet pride in what they had built together. The galaxy was far from perfect, and the Council of Eldora, though weakened, still held power. But the coalition had given the galaxy something it hadn't had in centuries: hope. And as long as that hope burned, Kale knew the future would be brighter. The void, no matter how vast, could never extinguish the light of unity.